The wind moved slow across the plains that morning, carrying the smell of thawing earth and the faint sweetness of prairie grass waking from winter's sleep. The Wyoming sky stretched wide overhead, pale blue at the edges and deepening toward the sun. Luke Callahan sat astride his chestnut gelding near the south fence line of his ranch, the brim of his hat pulled low against the light. He watched a distant hawk circle lazily above the hills. Out here, the world moved at its own pace. Folks in town might call it lonely, but Luke had grown used to the quiet. It had been his companion for years. The early spring had been kind so far. Snow still lingered in the shady folds of the hills, but the ice in the creek had broken weeks ago. Calves bawled from the pasture beyond the barn, and the smell of damp soil mixed with the dry scent of last summer's hay. Luke guided the horse toward the corral, boots creaking in the stirrups, mind already turning to the day's chores, patching a broken rail, checking the roof shingles after last night's wind, making the trip into Red Creek for supplies before the afternoon clouds rolled in. The gelding stopped near the barn. Luke swung down, landing with the easy weight of a man who'd been riding since boyhood. He ran a calloused hand along the horse's neck, murmured a low word of thanks, then turned toward the tack room. His reflection caught briefly in the small, cracked window above the saddle rack. Even in the dusty glass, the scar stood out, a pale slash running from just above his left temple, cutting down across the cheekbone before disappearing near his jawline. It had healed years ago, but the skin there never lost that drawn, stretched look. Most days, he ignored it. Some days, it stared back at him like a question he didn't want to answer. The townsfolk didn't ask much anymore. The first year after it happened, people had whispered plenty. Some said it was a bullet graze. Others claimed it came from a knife in a poker brawl. Luke never confirmed either way, and eventually the curiosity faded, though he still caught the occasional glance in the mercantile or saloon. Out here on the ranch, there was no one to look at him like that. The cattle didn't care, the wind didn't care. That suited him just fine. By mid-morning, he had the wagon hitched. The road to Red Creek wound for 6 miles through open country, passing only one other ranch before the land sloped toward town. The ride was easy, the gelding's hooves kicking up the scent of dust and last year's grass. The nearer he got, the more the quiet gave way to the sounds of civilization, hammering from the blacksmith's forge, the rattle of a freight wagon, a dog barking somewhere behind the saloon. Luke kept his head down, touching the brim of his hat in brief greeting to the few folks who called out his name. He stopped first at the feed store, loaded a few sacks of grain into the wagon, then steered the team toward the general store. Old Mr. Randall was behind the counter, sorting bolts of cloth for his wife. The place smelled of coffee, leather, and the faint tang of soap. Luke stepped inside, the doorbell giving a soft jingle. He had taken 2 steps toward the counter when a deep, steady voice spoke his name. Luke Callahan. He turned. Standing near the far wall was Chief Tall Elk of the Lakota, a man Luke had seen only a handful of times in his life. The chief was tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair streaked with silver. Beside him stood 2 women, one older, one younger. They were dressed simply, long skirts of earth tones, shawls drawn against the breeze that drifted in from the open door. Both wore their hair in braids, though the older sister's fell heavier and smoother, while the younger's had loose wisps framing her face. "Chief," Luke said with a nod. "Didn't expect to see you in town." Tall Elk studied him for a long moment before speaking. "I have something to ask of you." "It is not small." Luke waited, feeling a shift in the air between them. The older woman, mid-20s, maybe, kept her gaze steady but calm. The younger, perhaps 16 or 17, glanced around the store with a spark of curiosity in her dark eyes. "Please," Tall Elk said, his voice low but carrying weight, "accept these 2 Indian women into your care." The words landed heavier than Luke expected. He looked from the chief to the women, then back again. "Care? What exactly do you mean?" "They cannot stay with the tribe for now," Tall Elk replied. "It is not safe. I trust you to keep them safe until the danger passes." Luke's brow furrowed. "Chief, I live alone out there. My place isn't set up for—" "I know what your place is set up for," Tall Elk interrupted, though without sharpness. "You have a spare cabin. You have no wife. You have no children to endanger. You are steady." Luke glanced again at the women. The older one, Ayanna, met his eyes for the first time. There was no plea in her gaze, only quiet strength, as if she'd already decided she would endure whatever came next. The younger, Kiona, shifted her weight, her braid swinging over one shoulder. Luke thought he saw the faintest hint of defiance in her stance. "I don't even know why it's dangerous for them," Luke said, trying to keep his tone even. "You don't need to know," Tall Elk said, though his eyes softened a fraction. "Only that it is so. Will you do this?" The silence stretched. Luke's instinct was to say no. He had built his life on keeping things simple, and this was anything but. Still, the chief's request carried a kind of gravity that wasn't easy to turn away from. Finally, Luke nodded once. "All right, for now." Tall Elk inclined his head in thanks. "For now will be enough." He murmured a few words in Lakota to the sisters. Ayanna gave the faintest bow of her head. Kiona's eyes lit briefly, though she said nothing. Within the hour, Luke had finished his errands and returned to the wagon. The sisters climbed into the back, settling among the sacks of grain and a coil of rope. The ride out of town began in silence. Luke kept his eyes on the road, but he caught glimpses of them in the corner of his vision. Ayanna sitting straight, hands folded neatly in her lap. Kiona leaning over the side of the wagon now and then to watch the landscape slide past. The farther they rode, the quieter the world became. The sound of the town faded, replaced by the steady creak of the wagon wheels and the distant cry of meadowlarks. Luke found himself wondering what their story was, why Tall Elk had chosen him of all people. He wasn't sure he wanted the answer. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the grass. Luke guided the team toward the small cabin that stood apart from the main house. It was plain but sturdy, built for extra hands during cattle season, though it had stood empty for years. He climbed down and motioned for them to follow. "This'll be yours for now," he said, pushing the door open. The interior smelled faintly of cedar. A narrow bed stood against one wall, a small table by the window, a stove in the corner. "Pump out back for water. You can cook here, or in the main house if you need." Ayanna stepped inside first, her eyes sweeping over the space with quiet assessment. Kiona followed, touching the edge of the table with her fingers, as if testing its smoothness. "I'll bring you some extra blankets," Luke added, already stepping back toward the wagon. "Nights can still get cold." They spoke little over supper. Luke returned to his own house, sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and listened to the soft wind outside. Somewhere in the darkness, he imagined the sisters settling in, perhaps speaking in low tones he couldn't understand. Above the ranch, the sky stretched wide and black, scattered with more stars than a man could count. For the first time in a long while, Luke wondered how much longer the quiet would last. The morning broke crisp and pale, a thin layer of frost still clinging to the grass in the shaded hollows. Luke was already at the barn, pitchfork in hand, turning hay for the cattle. The sun had barely cleared the horizon, but the light spilled across the fields in soft gold, warming the air with promise. From the corner of his eye, he saw a movement by the guest cabin. Ayanna stepped out, her shawl drawn close, and walked toward the pump with a bucket in hand. She moved with the quiet grace of someone used to the rhythm of early mornings. Kiona followed a moment later, her braid swinging, her steps quicker, almost skipping over the frost-hardened ground. Luke kept working, but his gaze flicked to them more often than he meant to. Ayanna worked the pump handle, filling the bucket in smooth, steady motions. Kiona crouched nearby, cupping her hands to catch the cold water and splashing her face with a gasp. The sound carried on the still air, bright and unguarded. It was the first real sign of ease he'd seen from her since they'd arrived. By the time Luke finished with the feed, the sisters were making their way back toward the cabin. Ayanna nodded politely in his direction, while Kiona gave a small wave before vanishing inside. He returned the nod and went about his chores, though the wave lingered in his mind longer than it should have. Mid-morning found him at the corral, checking the rails where one of the steers had pushed through last week. Kiona appeared at the gate, hands clasped behind her back. "Can I help?" she asked, her voice carrying a mixture of eagerness and caution. Luke studied her for a beat, then handed her a hammer. "Hold the rails steady while I set the nails." She grinned and stepped up beside him. For the next half hour, they worked in companionable silence, the steady rhythm of hammer blows echoing against the hills. Now and then, she asked questions about the horses, the cattle, the seasons on the ranch. He answered in his usual short manner, but her curiosity seemed undeterred. When the last nail was set, she leaned on the rail, looking toward the barn. "Do you ride every day?" "Most days," he replied. "Work's easier on horseback." Her eyes brightened. "Will you teach me?" Luke hesitated. Teaching someone to ride wasn't hard, but it meant spending more time together than he'd planned. Still, something in her expression reminded him of himself at her age. Restless, hungry for the freedom of open country. "Tomorrow," he said finally, "we'll start with saddling." Her smile was quick and unguarded before she turned and jogged back to the cabin. That evening, after a simple supper, Luke sat on the porch with his coffee. The air was cooling fast, the horizon painted with streaks of red and orange fading into violet. Ayana appeared at the edge of the porch steps, holding a small jar wrapped in cloth. "For your hands," she said softly. "You work them hard." He accepted the jar, unscrewing the lid to find a salve with a faint, clean scent, something like sage and pine. "Made it yourself?" She nodded. "It will help with the cracks." "Thank you," he said, and meant it. Her eyes lingered on his for a moment longer than was necessary before she turned back toward the cabin. The salve was smooth and cool against his skin. He found himself wondering what other quiet skills she kept hidden. The days began to take on a new shape. Kiona rose early to watch the horses, sometimes pestering Luke with questions before breakfast. Ayana tended to their small space, hung herbs to dry in the sunlight, and occasionally left small bundles of them by his door. He didn't ask how she knew what might help him, but he used everything she offered. It was on the 6th evening that the moment came. They were inside the main house, a fire crackling in the hearth. Luke had invited them in when the wind turned sharp that afternoon. Kiona had gone to bed early in the cabin, claiming she was tired from riding lessons, leaving Luke and Ayana alone at the table. The light from the fire caught the curve of her cheek, the shine of her dark hair. Her gaze moved to his scar, lingering there. "How did it happen?" she asked quietly. He set his coffee cup down. "Ranch work has its dangers." "That is not from ranch work," she said, her tone certain. Luke's jaw tightened. "Why do you say that?" "Because I know the man who gave it to you." Her words were calm, but they struck like a stone dropped into still water. His chair scraped lightly against the floor as he shifted. "You're sure about that?" She nodded once. "Years ago, my people were attacked. There was a man among them with a mark on his arm, a snake, inked black and twisted. He smiled when he hurt others." Her eyes met his. He had that same smile the night he cut you. Luke's mind pulled him back to the canyon, the ambush, the flash of steel. He remembered the glint of a snake tattoo on a muscled forearm, the sneer that followed as the knife came down. He had not thought of that face in detail for years, but hearing her speak of it now brought it back with terrible clarity. "You've seen him since?" Luke asked. "No," she said, "but he still lives, and he is not far from here." They sat in silence for a long moment, the fire popping softly between them. Luke realized their lives had crossed long before this meeting, tangled in ways neither could have guessed. He felt the old anger stir, but alongside it came something else, an unshakable urge to keep her safe. When she rose to leave, she paused at the door. "Scars are not only for the one who carries them," she said, her voice low. Then she stepped into the night, the door closing softly behind her. Luke sat alone at the table, the words echoing in his mind, knowing that from this moment forward, nothing on the ranch would be quite the same. The wind shifted the next morning, coming in from the north with a sharper edge that carried the scent of wood smoke from somewhere far off. Luke was in the yard early, stacking fence posts by the corral, when he caught sight of Ayanna walking slowly along the ridge above the ranch house. Her shawl fluttered behind her in the breeze, and every so often she would stop, stoop to gather something from the ground, and tuck it into the pouch at her waist. He guessed it was herbs or roots, but the way she moved, unhurried yet deliberate, caught his attention more than the task itself. Kiona was already at the barn, leaning on the lower half of the stall door, watching one of the mares. "She likes me," she said as Luke passed. "Horses don't like anyone unless they're fed regular," he answered, but there was a hint of dry humor in his voice. "She likes me," Kiona insisted, giving the mare a quick pat before turning toward him. "Can we ride today? I want to go farther." "We'll go as far as the creek," he said. Past that, the ground soft from last week's rain. Her grin was instant. "I'll saddle her." He watched her bustle off, braid swinging, a burst of energy that cut through the chill of the morning. Somewhere deep down, Luke felt the faint warmth of something he hadn't thought about in a long time, company that didn't weigh on him. Still, the memory of Ayanna's words from 2 nights ago clung to him, a man with a snake tattoo somewhere nearby. It wasn't a warning he could take lightly. By midday, Kiona was riding ahead on the trail to the creek, her laughter carrying over the hoofbeats. Luke kept a watchful eye on the horizon. The land here rolled out in long, golden waves, the grass just starting to green under the touch of spring. The mountains in the distance were still capped in snow, bright against the blue. When they reached the creek, Kiona dismounted and crouched by the water, trailing her fingers through the current. "Feels colder than last week," she said. "That's the snow melt," Luke replied, scanning the far bank. He saw nothing unusual, just the rippling grass and the flash of a meadowlark, but a prickle ran up the back of his neck all the same. They headed back slower, Kiona humming under her breath. When they reached the ranch, Ayanna was sitting on the porch steps, sorting a bundle of dried plants. She looked up, her gaze flicking from Luke's face to the rifle still strapped across his saddle. Something in her eyes told him she'd noticed the way he'd been scanning the land. That night over supper, Ayanna finally asked, "You feel them near, don't you?" Luke's spoon paused over his plate. "I don't feel anything, but I'm not one to wait for trouble to knock." She studied him for a long moment. "We could leave," she said quietly, "go back to my people, or somewhere else." He shook his head. "If they're looking for you, they'll follow. Better to face them here on ground I know." Kiona looked between them, frowning. "What are you talking about?" Luke met her eyes. "Just talking about keeping you both safe." The girl crossed her arms. "I can keep myself safe, too." It was on the tip of his tongue to tell her she didn't understand the kind of men they might be dealing with. But something in her stubborn gaze stopped him. He only nodded. "All the same, you stay close to the cabin at night." The next few days passed under a strange tension. Luke went about his work, mending fences, checking the herd, but he found himself watching the ridges more than the cattle. Kiona still came to the barn every morning, asking questions about bridles and tack. Ayanna spent her hours between the cabin and the hills, gathering, drying, and grinding plants into powders or salves. Once, when Luke came by to drop off extra firewood, he saw her at the table, the lamplight making her hair shine like polished ebony, hands moving steadily as she mixed something in a small clay bowl. She looked up, and for a moment neither spoke. On the 4th day, he rode into Red Creek for supplies. The streets were busier than usual, wagons from outlying ranches bringing in early-season wool and hides. In the saloon, he overheard 2 men at the bar, talking low. "Swear I saw him at the crossing yesterday," one said. "Could be," the other replied. "Word is he's head in, this way with a couple of his boys." Luke's hand tightened on the glass of water he'd ordered. He didn't need to hear a name to know who they meant. By the time he left town, the clouds had rolled in heavy, the air smelling of rain. He pushed the gelding hard on the way back, the ranch coming into view just as the first drops began to fall. Ahiana was on the porch, watching the road. She didn't ask what he'd heard, but her eyes told him she already knew. That night, the wind rose, rattling the shutters. Luke sat at the table cleaning his rifle, the lamplight throwing shadows across the walls. Ahiana sat opposite him, mending a tear in one of Kiona's skirts. Kiona herself was sprawled in the chair by the hearth, braiding and unbraiding a length of twine. "What will you do if they come?" Kiona asked suddenly. Luke didn't look up from the rifle. "Same thing I've always done when trouble comes. Deal with it." "And if they come for us?" "Then they'll find out they picked the wrong place to try." Ayana's needle paused mid-stitch. "We will help you," she said, and there was no hesitation in her voice. Luke met her gaze across the table. "I'm not asking you to." "You don't have to," she said simply. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind howled through the eaves, carrying with it the scent of rain and something else, something sharper, like the air before lightning strikes. Luke set the rifle aside and leaned back in his chair. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow, we make sure this place is ready for whatever's coming." The look they gave him told him they understood. Even if none of them spoke the word, they were all thinking. War. The day dawned gray, the kind of sky that seemed to press low over the land. Luke had been awake since before first light, moving through the barn in silence, checking every latch, every rail, every tool he might need. The storm from the night before had passed, leaving the air damp and cold, but his mind wasn't on the weather. He had a sense, deep in his gut, that this would be the day. Ayana stood by the porch, arms wrapped in her shawl, watching him as he came up from the barn. Her eyes asked the question she didn't voice. He only gave a slight shake of his head, though the truth was different. He could feel trouble breathing on the back of his neck. Kiona emerged from the cabin carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "I made arrows," she said, lifting it toward him like an offering. Her face was serious, no trace of the carefree spark she usually carried. Luke took the bundle and looked over the arrows. The shafts were straight, the fletching neat. "Good work," he said, passing them back. "Keep them close tonight." They spent the daylight hours preparing. Luke made a circuit of the property, reinforcing weak points in the fencing, making sure the horses were secure in the barn. He checked the rifles, laid out ammunition where it would be easy to reach. Ayana gathered herbs from her stores, grinding them into a paste she said would stop bleeding if it came to it. Kiona tested the draw of her bow over and over, the twang of the string a sharp note in the heavy stillness. By the time the sun began to sink, a deep quiet had settled over the ranch. The wind had gone still, the air thick and waiting. Luke stood on the porch, scanning the horizon. To the west, the last light of day bled into the clouds. To the east, the shadows deepened fast, swallowing the low hills. He knew they would come under cover of darkness. He went inside to light the lamps. Ayana moved quietly in the kitchen, setting a pot of coffee on the stove. She glanced up as he passed. "When it starts, don't waste shots," she said softly. "I know," he replied, "and when it starts, you and Kiona stay low." Ayana didn't argue, but her look told him she had no intention of hiding if the fight came to the door. It began just after full dark. Luke was by the front window when he caught the flicker of movement along the tree line beyond the pasture. A moment later, the faint jingle of tack drifted on the air. He stepped away from the glass. "They're here," he said. Kiona was already moving to the loft of the barn, bow in hand. Ayana followed Luke to the front room. He handed her a revolver. "Only if you have to," he told her. She took it without hesitation. The first shot came from the dark. Wild, a test more than a threat. Luke waited, ears straining. Then he saw them, shadows breaking from the tree line, spreading out toward the house. There were at least 8 of them, maybe more, moving low and fast. He fired the first answering shot, the report shattering the night. One of the figures dropped to the ground, motionless, the rest fanned wider. Bullets hit the side of the house, splinters flying from the window frame. From the barn loft, Kiona loosed an arrow. The cry rang out, sharp and pained, followed by the sound of someone crashing into the dirt. Luke moved to the side door, firing at two men trying to circle toward the back. He caught one in the shoulder, the other dove behind a trough. Ayanna stayed by the window, eyes sharp, revolver steady. She fired once, and Luke saw a man spin and fall hard. He felt a flicker of pride. She hadn't wasted the shot. The fight pushed closer. Two men broke from cover and charged the porch. Luke met them head-on, the rifle butt smashing into the first man's jaw. The second swung a knife, the blade flashing in the lamplight. Luke caught his wrist, twisting hard, sending the knife skidding across the boards. A punch to the gut dropped him. And then he saw him, the snake tattoo, black and coiled, crawling up a bare forearm. The man stepped from the shadows, grinning, like the years hadn't passed at all. "Didn't think I'd see you again, Callahan," he called. Luke's grip on the rifle tightened. "Should have stayed gone," he said. The outlaw laughed and came forward, firing as he moved. Luke ducked back, the bullet tearing a splinter from the doorframe. The next moment they were on each other, the rifle knocked aside, fists and elbows striking in the close dark. The man was strong, the years adding weight but not slowing him. He swung wild but hard, one blow catching Luke across the jaw. Luke staggered, tasting blood, then drove forward, ramming his shoulder into the outlaw's chest. They hit the porch rail, wood groaning under the impact. From somewhere behind, Kiona's voice rang out. "Luke!" He didn't have time to answer. The outlaw pulled a blade from his belt, slashing at his side. Luke caught his wrist with both hands, forcing it back inch by inch until the knife clattered to the boards. They grappled, each trying to throw the other. Luke felt the edge of the porch under his boots, the drop to the dirt below. With a surge of effort, he drove the outlaw backward, twisting his arm until there was a sharp crack, and the man cried out. Before the fight could turn again, a shout came from the yard. "Sheriff!" The beam of a lantern swept across the scene, and a half-dozen deputies poured in, guns drawn. The remaining outlaws broke, some running for the tree line, others dropping their weapons as the law closed in. Luke stepped back, chest-heaving, and handed the outlaw over to the sheriff himself. The man glared at him but said nothing as his hands were bound. The yard was littered with the signs of the fight: spent shells, dropped weapons, trampled dirt. Ayanna stood by the porch steps, revolver still in hand, her face pale but steady. Kiona climbed down from the barn loft, bow slung over her shoulder, her eyes scanning Luke as if to make sure he was still standing. "It's done," the sheriff said, hauling the outlaw toward his horse. "You'll want to get that side looked at," he added, nodding to the thin line of blood darkening Luke's shirt. Luke nodded, but didn't move toward the house yet. He stood there a moment longer, looking out at the now quiet land, the stars wheeling cold and bright overhead. The night had been broken wide open, but somehow, in the stillness that followed, it felt like the ranch had settled into a deeper kind of peace. The dawn after the fight came slow and soft, the air crisp but carrying the faint warmth of spring. Luke woke to the sound of a meadowlark somewhere beyond the corral, its song sharp in the stillness. For the first time in weeks, the weight in his chest wasn't the kind that pressed him forward into battle. The yard was quiet. No shadows moved at the tree line. No steel glinted in the moonlight. He stepped out onto the porch, mug of coffee in hand, and let his eyes travel over the land. The earth showed the scars of the night before: trampled grass, broken boards on the porch rail, a few dark stains in the dirt, but there was no danger in the air. Only the smell of damp soil and fresh wood smoke from the cabin. Ayanna was outside already, shawl wrapped loosely around her shoulders, bent over the herb patch she'd started near the cabin. She was cutting sprigs of something green and fragrant, her hair catching the morning light. She looked up when she heard him, her expression calm, almost content. "How's your side?" she asked, straightening. "I've had worse," he said, though the bandage under his shirt pulled tight when he moved. "Thanks to you, it's not bad at all." She gave a small smile. "You kept your word. We're safe." Kiona emerged from the barn, leading her favorite horse, its coat glossy from a good brushing. She swung into the saddle with an ease that hadn't been there weeks ago, and rode off toward the far pasture, her laughter carrying back on the breeze. It was the kind of sound Luke realized he hadn't heard much of in years, the sound of life filling a place, chasing away the echoes of loneliness. He walked over to Ayana, leaning lightly on the fence beside her. "Feels different today," he said. "It is different," she replied. "You fought for this place. For us. That changes the land. It changes you." He glanced at her, the morning light soft across her face. "That scar of mine used to feel like it was the only thing folks saw when they looked at me. Now it's different." "How?" she asked, her voice quiet. "It's not just mine anymore," he said after a pause. "It's part of our story now, a reminder of what's worth standing up for." For a long moment they simply stood together, the breeze lifting strands of her hair, the sun warming their backs. Then Luke reached down without thinking, his fingers brushing hers where they rested on the fence rail. She didn't pull away. Instead, her hand turned in his, her fingers fitting into his palm as if they'd been meant to find each other all along. As the day wore on, they set about mending what had been broken. Luke repaired the porch rail with Kiona's help, her chatter filling the air as she worked. Ayana brought them cool water from the pump and a plate of bread she'd baked that morning, its crust golden and fragrant. By evening, the ranch felt whole again. The sunset spread in streaks of orange and rose across the sky, painting the fields in warm light. Luke and Ayana walked the fence line together, their pace slow, talking about nothing and everything. Now and then their shoulders brushed, and each time, neither of them moved away. Out in the pasture, Kiona rode her horse in wide, looping circles, her laughter once again drifting back toward them. The cabin windows glowed in the falling light, and smoke curled lazily from the chimney. The air smelled of wood and grass, and the faint sweetness of spring flowers. When they reached the far corner of the fence, Luke stopped, resting his hands on the top rail. "You thinking of going back to your people now that it's safe?" he asked. Ayana was quiet for a moment, then shook her head. "This feels like home now." Her words settled deep in him, warm and steady. He turned toward her, and she met his gaze without flinching. There was no need for more words. The sky deepened to violet, the first stars appearing above them, and in that moment, Luke knew the quiet he'd always thought he wanted had changed. It wasn't the silence of being alone anymore. It was the peace of belonging. They walked back toward the cabin as the night gathered around them, side by side, hands joined loosely. And for the first time in a long while, Luke Callahan felt certain that whatever the horizon held, he wouldn't be facing it alone. Sometimes, the battles we fight aren't just against the enemies before us, but against the shadows that have lived inside us for years. Luke Callahan's scar was once a reminder of pain, but now it tells the story of survival, of courage, and of the love that found him when he least expected it. In the wide, wild West, sometimes the hardest journeys lead you right where you belong. If you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles so you won't miss the next heart-stirring adventure of love, danger, and destiny on the untamed frontier. There are many more stories waiting to ride your way.